Welcome back. Today our focus is on the question of ethnic and racial minorities within the United Church of Canada. And this is one of several topics that we'll look at this term where the range is longitudinal. Rather than taking place at a specific time or during a specific decade, we are looking at actions and experiences that in some cases span decades. One of the things we have to realize, if we haven't recognized it yet, is the degree to which the United Church of Canada is an expression of its culture, for good or for ill. We're a very Canadian institution, and we exist within a larger Canadian society, and often the members of the church look and think and work and sound very much like those around them in the dominant culture. And the United Church of Canada has, for most of its history, been a dominant culture institution, at least in terms of membership, being Anglo-Saxon or Northern European in origin and heritage. And so throughout much of our history, it's perhaps not surprising, although often regrettable, that church members have reflected the attitudes and opinions of those in their society when it came to members of distinctly visible minorities. Occasionally, those common attitudes have been resisted by official church pronouncements. Sometimes they've been reinforced. On the one hand, I think we would have to say that some of the responses to experiences of exclusion and oppression of many different groups have been pretty feeble in the main, although there were some quite heroic instances that we'll have occasion to talk about in this lecture and in other lectures. But on the other hand, we might say that in contrast to the rest of Canadian society, those tentative steps can be seen as examples of working towards greater justice, however small and inadequate the individual steps might have been. We're sort of in an in-between place, perhaps. The recent 43rd General Council of the United Church closed on a very powerful note. One of the intercultural observers, the Reverend Dr. Paul Wolfel, reflected back to us his experience of being a black minister in a predominantly white church. His reflection is on your list of resources for this week, and if you haven't watched it, I'd ask you to please do so now, before you finish this lecture, because it will set something of a context for the things I'm going to say that stretch over several decades. And so what was your reaction to Paul's statement? How did it make you feel? Could you identify or perhaps identify with some of the examples he gave? How do you think people in your congregation would have responded to what Paul said? Is that a video clip that you could share with them? Why or why not? To be there at the 43rd General Council was very powerful, for it was as if Paul's testimony opened up a floodgate of ethnic and racialized accounts from people who were there as General Council commissioners. And even here I recognize that I'm stumbling because the language remains very fluid. At the denominational level, we have an Ethnic Ministries Council, and many people refer to those who are visibly not from the dominant culture as racialized, and so I'm going to use the words interchangeably, and maybe it's something you'll want to discuss in your posting or talk about during our class meeting. But the many accounts given at General Council were both powerful and moving. They were stories of racist behavior happening within the church. They were racist behavior on both small and large scale, but they were obviously significant to the ones telling the stories. And so I think that this may be our next great task as a united church, to extend efforts at reconciliation beyond First Nations to include other non-numerically dominant groups in our church. What does it really mean to all be members of the United Church of Canada, even though visually we may appear different to one another? We recognize that the topic of prejudice and racism is as old as Canada and as young as the striking and shocking recent headlines. There's the racial profiling of darker-skinned immigrants, assaults on hijab-wearing women, attacks on mosques, the politicization of immigration and inclusion as hot-button issues for some voters. What does it mean for Canada to be a multicultural society? Are we genuinely prepared to welcome refugees? Examining the historical record allows us to appreciate the enormity of the situation. It also encourages us to embrace solutions if our goal is to address overt as well as covert forms of racism in Canada. Because some would suggest that, given that racism in Canada is often less overt and physically aggressive than in, for example, the United States or Great Britain, it's even harder for us to address. Language is important. The term prejudice refers to negative attitudes directed to an entire category of people. This is by no means always based on race or skin color. There is lots of non-race-based prejudice out there. But in this lecture, race is our focus. And so it is possible for individuals within groups who are considered racialized to also be prejudiced. For instance, we read of people being insulted or called out for not being black enough. That charge was leveled against former President Barack Obama. It's been leveled at current vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris because of her mixed race heritage. Similar opinions and expressions exist in every community. So prejudice is expressed and experienced potentially universally. Maybe you've been the recipient of prejudice which may not be based on race, but is based on some assumption about you. Racism, strictly speaking, is the belief that certain groups or races are innately superior to others, and racism is also coupled with the power to enforce subordination, marginalization, and mistreatment of those groups. So racism is a system, and that's important to remember in our society, which so often focuses on the individual. It's entirely possible for someone who would never engage in overtly racist talk or racist behavior to benefit from a racist society. Thus, racism, whether it's in the society or in the church, impacts us all. And we explore some of that reality in the white privilege units of our United Church Formation program. And one of the significant things about racism, strictly speaking, is that one group has the power to change the systemic situation, while the other group does not. Let me give you an example. For instance, in what was to become Canada, when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1834 and black men became citizens, they had the legal right to vote. However, the exercise of that right was often disrupted both by white mobs and by local legislation across the colonies that became Canada, legislation that restricted voting rights to people who owned property or had taxable net worth. And so we find that many blacks, along with many poor and working class whites, were disenfranchised. We would say that the blacks were racially disenfranchised, so they were the victims of racism. The poor and working class whites were economically or class-based disenfranchised, but they did not have racial prejudice expressed against them. Both groups were disenfranchised, and the only people with the power to change the situation were wealthier white men who could vote. The irony is that so often the system has worked such that the wealthy white men who control the system get the poor and working class whites and blacks and other minorities fighting with one another when their enemy is really someplace else. Continuing with that illustration, Black women, along with all other women, were denied voting rights federally until 1918, and longer in some provinces. Again, we have a situation where they did not have the legal power to change the situation. So women were disenfranchised as a group. Black women lived in the intersectionality of their disenfranchisement as well as the racial prejudice. And so we find that racism includes not only negative attitudes towards a particular group of people, but also the power to enforce that attitude. So by definition, a term like reversed racism is dismissed as meaningless by many authors, because the minority group lacks the power to enforce their dislike. Prejudice, however, can be felt and expressed by any group. The arrival of the Europeans and their interaction with First Nations people is a story of both prejudice and racism within the overarching narrative of colonialism. It's estimated that before the year 1500, there were some 500 First Nations on Turtle Island, with 58 languages and many well-developed social institutions. It was the assumption, the racist assumption of white superiority over so-called savages, that gave license to appalling acts of depredation. And we will speak later in the course about Indian residential schools, but they are only a chapter in the systemic effort to assimilate, civilize, and Christianize Aboriginal people, and so absorb them into white culture. The current status of Canada's First Nations reflect the results of 400 years of cultural domination, exploitation, and subjugation, with only a comparatively brief number of efforts to try and reverse that process. When we turn to individuals of Black ancestry, the first Africans came to Canada in the early 1600s. And we find that some were slaves, while others were skilled free persons. There's a credible report that the translator for Samuel de Champlain was a man of African heritage. Later, still, there were those who were United Empire loyalists. They fled the United States after the American Revolution. The treatment of white and Black loyalists gives us a glimpse of racism in action. White loyalists in Nova Scotia were each given a 40-acre land grant, while Black loyalists, by and large, were settled on scrubland at the edge of white townships and communities. Unlike white loyalists, they were not given outright ownership of land, the excuse being that they were simple and they would be taken advantage of by unscrupulous characters. And that has impact even into our day. So, for instance, in the region of Halifax, in the 1880s, a church-based community of Blacks was established in Africville on land specifically given by Queen Victoria. They established a community, schools, church, and so on. The land was expropriated and the houses were razed in the 1960s to make room for a bridge across the Halifax harbor. Although apologies have been issued, struggles continue to this day to secure appropriate compensation for the residents. And part of the challenge around compensation, at least according to the courts, has to do with establishing the matter of ownership. Even though there is plenty of narrative testimony of a family living in a particular location over generations, it's the paperwork which is so valued by the racist system, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, for people to establish the ownership which would lead to appropriate compensation. In southern Ontario, significant numbers of Blacks arrived through immigration and via the Underground Railway. Those growing numbers led to a response that was embodied in the Ontario Common Schools Act, which was passed in 1850. It legalized racially segregated schools. The law was not repealed until 1964. Black enlistment and service in both world wars was restricted, and the black battalions that were formed all had white officers. It was not until the Fair Accommodation Practices Act in 1954 that hotels, restaurants, recreational clubs, and movie theaters were officially desegregated. And so it was that in the 1930s, the Reverend Wilbur Howard, who was a national staff person for youth ministries, was refused accommodation in a hotel in Essex, Ontario, when he was there on church business, refused because of his race. In the latter decades of the 20th century, there were significant waves of black immigration from the Caribbean portions of the British Commonwealth. Those people carry their own stories of exploitation that are different in significant elements from that of the North American black experience and the experience that originates in Africa. But as a result of this historic segregation in many parts of the country, we find separated black churches and denominations of long standing. We also find separated or predominantly black churches within the United Church of Canada. The Union Church was formed in Montreal in the 1920s, largely because blacks were not welcome in predominantly white Protestant congregations. And it continues today as a strong black presence in the city. In the Maritimes, most blacks who identify as Christian are generally members of Baptist and Pentecostal traditions. Ezekiel Hart was the first Jew to be elected to a Canadian legislature. In 1807, he was elected in Trois-Rivières to the legislature of Lower Canada, but he was barred from taking his seat. He was barred again when he was re-elected in 1808. His constituents wanted him to serve, but anti-Semitism led to his being forbidden to take his seat. It was 1837 before an act was passed conferring full rights to Jews, at least in theory. However, racism and prejudice continue today, with systemic racist refusal to employ Jews in large organizations such as banks and police forces lasting well into the 1930s. And they were barred from elite social clubs, beaches, and holiday resorts in Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba. And universities also set limits on the enrollment of Jews. Canada was pervasively anti-Semitic, and the churches did little to contest or combat that. Anti-Semitism was reflected in Canada's treatment of Jews fleeing Europe prior to World War II. A Canadian official at that time, asked by journalists how many Jewish refugees would be admitted, famously replied, "None is too many." With such an outlook, it should be no surprise that Canada had the worst record of any Western country in providing refuge to Jews fleeing Hitler's Europe in the 1930s and 40s. Finally, in 1947, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King pledged to remove objectionable discrimination from Canada's Immigration Act. Nonetheless, Canada continued to practice selected restriction, which favored immigrants from Britain, Ireland, France, or America. When we turn to the treatment of Asians, we have several different groups who have both unique and shared experiences. Chinese laborers were recruited as cheap workers for the building of the National Railway, and about 15,000 were brought to Canada, and they suffered significant casualties as they were often given the most dangerous assignments and lower wages. Then, when the railway was finished, the survivors were treated as unwelcome guests. In 1885, a head tax was placed on every Chinese wanting to enter Canada. In 1885, it was set at $50. It was raised to $100 in 1900 and $500 in 1903, an absolutely astronomical sum. There was a generalized fear of the yellow peril, and it's evident in the words of government official John S. MacDonald, "A Mongolian or Chinese population in our country would not be a wholesome element." End of quote. In 1923, Chinese were completely barred from entering Canada, and those already here were not allowed to sponsor their family members, and that's the only Asian group that was singled out in that way. This statute was not repealed until 1947, which was the same year that Chinese Canadians were allowed to vote and finally allowed admittance to professions such as law, pharmacy, and accountancy. More recently, increased immigration from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Southeast Asia have sparked anti-Chinese sentiments around housing, business malls, taking up university spaces, and so on. And then, most recently, identification by public figures of COVID-19 as a disease of Chinese origin have increased the levels of prejudice. Like the Chinese, early immigrants from Japan contributed much to the development of Canada, primarily in British Columbia, through working in fishing and fruit and vegetable growing industries. They were model citizens, although they were not allowed to vote, and that did not spare them racist oppression. All Asians tended to be lumped together. For instance, the Japanese section of Vancouver was caught up in the anti-Oriental riots of 1907 and largely destroyed, although the focus was supposedly Chinese. In 1942, over 22,000 Japanese born here in Canada, naturalized Canadians, and immigrants were declared enemy aliens, and they were shipped off and stripped of their rights. They were shipped off to mining ghost towns in the interior of British Columbia, to sugar beet farms in Alberta, or to work on road construction. Having been declared enemy aliens, their homes, their properties, their businesses were confiscated, or they were auctioned off at rock-bottom prices, and whole families were removed to the internment camps. Most were not allowed to return to the coast following the war, but they were forced to relocate to communities in the British interior. Some were even forced to return to Japan, even though they might have been Canadian-born. And we'll say more about this chapter in Canada's history when we turn to the United Church's response to the war, where we actually did a little bit better than the society around us. The Multiculturalism Act of 1988 led to an acknowledgement of wrong on the part of the Canadian government, an apology, and a compensation of $21,000 per survivor by the Canadian government, a moral victory, if an inadequate response. Indians from South Asia, primarily Sikhs, were recruited to work in the forests of Western Canada. Following the liberalization of the Immigration Act in 1967, more Indians from different parts of the subcontinent have settled in other parts of Canada and entered into a variety of professions, and in different parts of the country we find different levels of prejudice and racism directed at them. And so, in summary, from the 1870s onward, the Canadian government, supported by most of the population, which included the churches, attempted to maintain a white country. Conveniently ignored the indigenous population, of course, but we saw that in the last couple of weeks when we've talked about the mission goals of the founding churches, where mission was also a matter of Canadianizing immigrants, and you were best off starting with at least stock that looked Caucasian. You could change them from Roman Catholics and Orthodox to good British Protestants. But immigrants who looked different were definitely not terribly welcome. Despite that predominant attitude in the society, within the United Church, so-called ethnic congregations were formed in many parts of the country, and they have a long history of loyalty to the denomination, loyalty which, at least as a member of the dominant group, I'm not always sure that we have deserved. In the 1950s, under pressure from the rest of the Commonwealth law, those immigration laws which Canada had relaxed very slowly. Immigrants from Europe were still highly favored. The number and sort of immigrants, of course, is a topic for intense debate. And in more recent years, with large numbers of Muslim immigrants, religion and culture have become flashpoints for many communities. And we've seen that in political and social discourse. The identifiable other becomes a convenient enemy for those who are seeking to establish and maintain power. How the church responds to them is a matter of ongoing question. And I believe, and it's certainly been my experience, that communities of faith form one place in which we can have conversation and meet and have interaction with, share food and missions with folk who are different in religion, language, and appearance. And it's demonstrated over and over again that it's difficult to remain prejudiced against someone who you know and know well. The matters of racism require a little bit more work to undertake. But then again, as members of the dominant culture, at least visibly, the United Church in large measure has the opportunity to change those laws in ways that the discriminated against groups can only imagine. So we have roles as listeners, as allies, as fellow walkers in this journey to become a more faithful nation. Faithful not just to the ideals of Christianity, but faithful to our common humanity. I look forward to our conversation in class.